Hey, Josh.
Glenn. How are you, Glenn?
I'm doing okay, thanks. How are you?
I'm okay. Dog kept me up a lot of the night last night, but
Okay,
comes
it
with the
sounded like it was a
territory.
close call, but I'm glad to know it came out that you're okay.
Yeah. Right. Right.
So,
Yeah, big day today. Or I don't know if it's a big day.
that is the cloture vote in the Senate
Yeah, the vote in the Senate.
last night, whenever it was.
Last night, 1 a.m. Eastern Time. Time designed to maximize the difficulty of Senator Byrd being present, but hey, whatever. Vote was 60-40.
Yep.
So the bill, if you were there, fortunately...
Being a good Democrat, of course, if I were there, I couldn't do the Joe Lieberman thing. I'd have to go along with the program. And I don't say that because I'm unenthusiastic about health reform.
Yeah.
But I can't get super enthusiastic about this particular rambling piece of legislation. There's an awful lot that's wrong with it. This has been much remarked.
Yeah.
And it does seem that we're down to a point now where, the president has to have this, the Democratic Party has to have this. We're most of us holding our noses about one thing or another and going ahead. And I suppose that's where I'd be if I were sitting in the U.S. Senate.
But so there was I watched a conversation the other day with Matt Taibbi and, Bob Kuttner. And
oh, yeah, I saw
Matt
that on Moyers.
Yeah, right, with Moyer. So Matt Taibbi says I would vote against it. I think that's not true. I think if he were in the Senate, he would vote in favor of it. Or if he would have voted against it, that's why he's not in the Senate in the first place. It's a selection issue. And Bob Kuttner said, in something like the way that you just said, that he would have voted in favor of it. But he was really the only time I heard anybody defend a vote in favor strictly on political grounds, that this would be disastrous for the party and for the president if this went down. And Moyer pushed back with him on that and said, well, isn't this a sign of the complete corruption of the process, that
you didn't act something like this.
That you didn't act something big like this, and the best reason that you can give for it is that it would be politically disastrous.
Yes.
But is that how you feel about it?
Do I feel that it's scandalous that avoiding the loss of face could be the main reason for enacting a massive piece of legislation like this? Is that what you ask me?
You think there's nothing to be said for it?
Is my motivation purely...
If you were number 61 rather than number 60, would you vote against it, so to speak? If your vote didn't matter to the thing's passage, would you vote against it? And is the only thing that you can...
Okay. So we're insuring an additional 30 million, so the number goes, Americans.
Yeah.
This is not a bad thing. This is a good thing. Okay, we're
Very
expanding coverage. So we are doing insurance reform, which is to say prohibiting health insurers from various business practices of theirs which were good for their bottom line, they thought, but which were very bad for consumers, we think. Such as screening people out on pre-existing conditions and dropping people's coverage under various pretenses and so forth. I think, on the whole, I think that's a good thing, too, although I just note that the sort of consensus against taking pre-existing conditions into account when one sells insurance makes it not quite insurance, or at least not insurance of a conventional kind.
Right.
It makes it social insurance. And one could argue that administering social insurance through social institutions is a more transparent and direct way of doing it than constraining private contracts so that they reproduce the effects of social insurance. I assume you know just what I'm getting at here.
Yes, yeah. So
because a pre-existing,
I agree with you that this is not really a private insurance scheme. I think, I think it shouldn't be. This is like the insurance that it's like if you had an insurance market where you could buy insurance and people didn't know what their medical status was. You're behind a kind of Rawlsian veil of ignorance. you don't know what your susceptibility to disease is, and you buy insurance under those conditions. So it's not a real insurance market. But why do you think it would be better to do that? When you say better to do that through social institutions, so you have two systems, Switzerland and Netherlands, where you've got, in effect, insurance companies treated as regulated utilities. They're private insurance providers that provide the health insurance, not a public system. But you've got people getting covered, and you've got regulation of that. Why? Howard Dean talked about this yesterday. He was kind of walking his way back from saying he would vote against the bill. He said it had been improved over the course of the week, and he said, that he was not a kind of ideological public option guy.
Yeah. But he thought it was dumping a ton of money on insurance companies by mandating that people buy private contracts.
Right.
And not having the robust public option, which would presumably compete down the terms on which those private contracts would be offered, so that the mandate wouldn't be so burdensome. Do I understand?
Right. Well, and I think more particularly, he has a kind of, he acknowledges that you could do a decent healthcare system with universal coverage and some serious cost controls through private insurance companies if you had robust public regulation of those insurance companies in the way that they arguably have in Switzerland and the Netherlands. And he's a little, he's for good reason skeptical that we certainly don't have that kind of public regulation now. A little skeptical that we're going to get it. He thinks we're inviting a 30-year fight with insurance companies, and that's probably right.
Maybe that's my point. My point being that, if someone walks into the Acme Insurance Company office and they have a pre-existing condition that is documented, then Acme has a pretty good idea that particular person's claims are going to be substantially higher than the average.
Right.
And would other things, no other constraints being present, would want to charge accordingly. And so that person would either be denied or would be offered insurance on terms commensurate with the risk that they constituted. Now, when you say that Acme Insurance can't do that on the argument of fairness, an argument, by the way, with which I agree, that is to say a person hasn't got any control over, they get cancer, now they're going to be wiped out because they had the misfortune. We're all in this thing together. Why don't we protect each other against that kind of thing?
Right. Exactly.
But my point is, put crudely, that's not Acme's problem. Acme is in business to make money. That's our problem. Okay, so now we've decided that Acme is a public carrier now, not any longer a private entity in business to make profits by applying its expertise on assessing and pricing risk. But instead, the instrument through which we, the people of the United States of America, are going to indemnify each other against the various things that can happen to us in life. Right. And when we do that, we then create this, this regulatory nexus, which is going to be battle after battle after battle with Acme, in business to make money, as always. We're not nationalizing Acme, and we're not expropriating their shareholders.
Exactly.
Where they're trying to make their bottom line look attractive to them, and we're trying to make sure that everybody who gets cancer gets treated and doesn't have to pay out of pocket for it.
Right.
And,
We've decided
my sense is that's a morass. I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but my feeling is that it would have been better done, more transparent, and more direct, but probably not politically feasible, if we simply announced that we, the people of the United States of America, will indeed indemnify each other through our public institutions, our Treasury, and our various and so on. And I guess I'm arguing for single payer in a way here, and that's where I would have come out on the intellectual merits. Right.
Well, I think what you just gave was a terrific summary of the rationale for having a single payer system. And I think, as you know, I agree with you on that. I think the situation we were in on this process from the beginning was that single payer was out. Public option was the alternative. And what I never really understood was why there was so much enthusiasm for a public option that would have covered 3 or 4% of the population, would have probably ended up covering people who were having trouble getting, health insurance elsewhere. So it would have been, the people who are least insurable. It would have been condemned on day one for being an incredibly costly system. Of course, it would have been costly because private insurers wouldn't have been covering it. But most of insurance would have continued to be provided through private insurers, and there would have been the same regulatory battles. Essentially what's happened is if this legislation goes through, and looks like it will, although there are many places for slips still, is that what's been decided is that there is, as Obama said during the campaign, there's a right to health care. Not a privilege, it's a right. And the way the right is going to be implemented and administered is through a system of private insurance, and that insurance companies are being, in essence, told, okay, you are now the implementers of a right, not simply the providers of a private benefit. And they're going to fight against that, absolutely. But they would have fought against it if we had a mini-me public option, which is what the public options were all looking like. So I think this contrast, the point that Howard Dean made yesterday on the Sunday talk shows is absolutely right. We are inviting a long-term conflict, long-term series of fights, in effect, in an effort to ensure to see that insurance companies act as the implementers, administrators of a right, rather than the providers of a private insurance contract. But I think that was the situation that we were in any case. Also, there's a point on this. There's another set of issues about this cost control issue. There are lots of. It's very easy. It's easy in principle to say how you get coverage for everybody, and that's in effect what's happened. To say how you get costs down is, as you know, much better than me, because you're an economist. It's a really hard issue. So it's all well and good to say, hey, the Mayo Clinic does a good job. Let's scale up the Mayo Clinic. Well, good work if you can get it. Right. Nobody really knows how to do that. Right. So what there are in this, what you see in the legislation is hundreds and hundreds of pages of bright ideas about how to get costs down.
Well, as David Brooks put it, he says, if it's ever been thought of, it's in there.
Well, and David Brooks is I thought that column of David Brooks it's a proof that David Brooks is a jerk.
Because he tried to have it both ways.
Because he's trying to have it both ways. Yeah. And he says what we really need. This is a guy who likes Hayek, who doesn't like comprehensive reform, who likes experimentation. Now, what you see in the bill is a proposal for a whole series of experiments.
I say he should, being a Hayekian, he should like it, huh?
He should have loved it. And there are two people who've made this case. Henry Aaron, not the home run hitter, but the health economist, and Gawande in a very interesting article in the New Yorker. About what, the idea is what you've got is not a master plan for getting costs down. And that's exactly on the driving costs. You don't want a master plan because nobody really knows exactly how to. This is an incredibly complicated system.
But by the same time, I'm sorry, Josh, I'm cutting you off.
No, you go ahead.
No, I see where you're going. You don't have a plan. What you have is a protocol for investigating a number of very promising leads likely to come to a plan. And I was just going to note, by that very same token, then, one cannot be confident or certain about what actual cost reductions will come about, because a lot of this stuff is experimental. We're going to see, there's some ideas out there, let's try them and see what works. But we're not going to know.
We're not going to know, but that's exactly right, and that's why in the CBO assessments, they don't, the CBO scoring, they don't attach cost control numbers to these. It's because it's exactly right. You don't know. What you hope is that some of these things are going to work. You don't know which ones they're going to be or what's going to emerge from them, or how something that works in some places is going to be, benchmark other places, what kind of pooling there's going to be of information. And but I think there's a strongly arguable case that's the right way to handle the cost control side of this, by saying, let's check a bunch of stuff out and see what works. The Gawande article is a very interesting comparison of this with what happens with the Agricultural Extension Service in the United States in the early part of the 20th century.
Oh, I see.
It's not a kind of government takeover. Anyway, so I don't. The bill. There are two things that you have to dislike. There are three things that you have to dislike about the bill. First of all, that it was produced by a process of bowing and scraping to, Joe Lieberman.
And Ben Nelson.
And Ben Nelson, but there's something anyway. Yeah, maybe there isn't anything particularly bad about Joe Lieberman. Why, who's counting here? But yeah, so there was a kind of that, serious unhappiness in the process. There is the fact that, as you said earlier, what it says to insurance companies, you guys need some new clients. Here's 30 million of them, and as many people have said, this is. The insurance company stocks have been doing very, very well over the past week. And then there's the more general fact that, as a number of people have said, that this has been produced by an extremely ugly process.
Can I just pause you on the stocks of insurance companies?
Yeah.
Because, as an economist, that's the kind of thing I pay attention to.
Yeah.
People are betting real money. And I'm not talking about Joe Blow on the street. I'm talking about professional investors. Are betting real money on the bottom line. I mean, there's not a lot of slippage between, you buy a share. You only make money if the share goes up. The share goes up if other people are willing to pay more for it. And they're willing to pay more if they think the underlying property is going to be more valuable. So there's just a lot of information, isn't there, in what savvy, anonymous, but spending their own real money, people believe will be the consequences for the financial health of the health insurance industry as a consequence of this legislation. The people with the money are betting that the insurance companies are going to make a killing.
Right.
I mean, that would have seemed to be the self-evident fact of the matter. So what do we have to say about that?
Well, we can. I suppose we can hope that investors in insurance companies have as much wisdom as investors in housing.
Okay. Well,
not really. No, I don't bet on. No, look at. I mean, I think it's what happens when you decide to implement. To go back to the earlier point, it's what happens when you decide to implement a right by, having private insurers implement that right. But is it plausible to think that if the handwriting was on the wall, that the legislation was going to have been passed with a mini-me public option covering 3 or 4% of the population, that, is it true that insurance company stock prices would have gone up a lot less? I mean, there still would have been a very large pool of people who insurance companies would have been able to harvest.
So, we're talking in a counterfactual voice here.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but I'm assuming that the reason that the insurance industry was so fiercely opposed to the public option in the first place is that 3 or 4% that you're talking about, they viewed as a kind of camel's nose under the tent sort of thing. And a lot of the details about the pricing of the public entity that would have been offering these insurance contracts were vague. And the possibility of public subsidy and a kind of, if it were an antitrust case, you would call it dumping or, anti-competitive practice because a seller sells a product below cost in order to drive the other people down. But if the government is doing it, we're going to call it keeping the insurance industry honest.
Yeah.
But all I'm saying is, you say 3 or 4%, and you say it was a small thing, but I bet you the insurance company didn't believe it was going to stay a small thing.
Well, I think that's a fair point, but I think it goes to, one of the issues about the politics of this, which maybe we should spend a few minutes talking about, because it's certainly getting a lot of attention, which is, lots of people said the public option was introduced by Jacob Hacker because he's a single payer guy who saw the handwriting on the wall right at the beginning, and single payer was not going to happen. So he says, here's a public option, and I'm sure this has happened with you. So there were lots of people who were in favor of a public option, and lots of people who were absolutely opposed to a public option. Lots of people who were in favor of single payer, and lots of people who were unalterably opposed to a single payer system. Okay, so now people come along and say, okay, look, this isn't single payer, this is a public option. And most of the people who are enthusiastic about the public option would say in private conversations, I'm sure you had these conversations, I certainly had them, they'd say, look, I don't really like the public option, but this is the first step toward a single payer. That's why I'm in favor of it. Okay, so people who didn't like single payer are just as smart as people who like single payer. They understood that the public option was a stalking horse, basically a stalking horse for a single payer system, and that's why they were opposed to it.
Yeah.
So I don't find the fact that you couldn't get that much. You got some more support for the public option than for single payer, but I think a lot of the opposition to the public option was from people who understood that people were in favor of it because they saw it as a first step. But there's this issue that's been getting argued about a lot, and to some extent, as every argument in the country now is a kind of nasty argument about whether liberals, progressives could have done better than what they've gotten, and who's to blame for the fact
the president has been getting slammed by a lot of people whom I thought were his friends, who have said he's failed to lead, failed to act in a sufficiently vigorous fashion, etc. Yeah.
Yes, I think Senator Feingold said that. Has really pointed the finger at him, and and Glenn Greenwald at Salon has been making this point that basically stop pointing the finger at Lieberman, point the finger at Obama. This is the bill that something like the bill that Obama wanted. I mean, he had said a long time ago that he was in favor of single payer. He backed off that. He said he was in favor of a public option. I don't think he really cared very much about the public option. He certainly didn't invest at all in it. But here's, I think, a basic underlying fact here, which really goes some way to answering this question about whether liberals, progressives could have done better. The basic fact is that no liberal or progressive in the Senate or in the House is going to vote against a bill that covers 30 million people, especially one that also drives the deficit down a little bit. Extends coverage to 30 million people. So you have, you have a Feingold, you have a Bernie Sanders. I mean, these people are not in the pockets of insurance companies. They voted in favor of closure. They are not going to vote against this bill, and nobody believes that they're going to vote against the bill. So they have no credible threat of walking away from this bill. No credible threat. They have zero bargaining power. Yep. So I think, they're not, as Van Jones would have put it, they're not assholes. They're not prepared to be assholes. They are not going to walk away from this. So I think the people like, Howard Dean and Andy Stern did a really great service over the course of the last week by starting to make really loud noise about improving the bill. And there have been some improvements in the bill over the last week. But the basic fact is that the Liebermans and the Nelsons and the Landrieux, and the Lincolns know that their colleagues in the Senate are not going to walk away from this bill, and so they couldn't. They don't have any bargaining power to improve it in a way that numbers 57, 58, 59, and 60 are going to dislike. And I think that I think is the basic situation that makes that made it virtually impossible to get a better deal than this. I mean, there are some other facts as well, like, for example, my guess is that when somebody writes the history of the past year, the political history of the past year, including the history on this healthcare reform, that what you're going to find is that there was some, meeting of, the leadership of the Republican Party in about March of this year, after they decided that it wasn't time to go on listening tours. They got beaten up by the Republican right for that. And they said, look, what we're going to do is just say no to everything. And when we say no to everything, given the way the Senate works in particular, what we are doing is is provoking a fight between the Feingolds and the Sanders.
You're giving them enough rope to hang themselves. Well, maybe that's the wrong metaphor, but you make a move which creates a situation such that they'll go on and do something which then you'll be able to run against later because it's going to be very imperfect.
Yeah, and also what you're gonna do is you're just gonna let Democrats, who are not a very unified party, fight stuff out. So if you ask who empowered Joe Lieberman, to be the swing voter on health care, it was a decision by the Republican Party to say they counted the votes. They're smarter than we are about politics. Me and you. I mean, not smarter than the Democrats. They counted the votes. They said we got 40 of them. What we're going to do is hand over all the legislation in the Senate to number 60. And they know that the progressives and liberals aren't going to walk away from something that extends a lot of coverage. So, I think...
Interesting thing. Let me ask you this, Josh.
Yeah.
I like that you follow the politics on this issue so closely. But my question is, I keep seeing these poll numbers saying that a substantial plurality of Americans think now that the legislation is not such a good idea, or disapprove of the president's handling of the health care issue. I can't remember the numbers exactly, but now more do than approve.
Right.
And I hear Republican politicians saying, go ahead and enact this. And you guys are going to take a real beating because it's not popular out there in the country. What do you think about that argument that the Democrats have now got themselves in a situation where they can't not pass a bill that actually a substantial number of Americans think is a very bad idea?
Excuse me, I think, as with everything, with everything else in American politics, what's going to the judgment on that issue, the retrospective judgment on that issue, is going to depend on the overall performance of the economy. If the economy is looking good in March or April of 2010, whatever health legislation was passed in late 2009, early 2010, is going to look like an incredibly bold stroke. If the economy is doing badly, it's just going to be painted with the same, brush, bad brushes, everything else. So,
but I don't think no one is forecasting a dramatic change in the economic situation within the next 6 months. I mean, we may technically have ended the recession, but my sense of it is that most people think the recovery to normal rates of unemployment is going to take a good while, maybe a couple of years.
Yeah. Well, it could be that this legislation doesn't look so great when people are running in 2010. I think, to go back to the top of the hour and when we started talking about voting in favor of this and voting in favor of it on political grounds, I don't think the damage to the Democratic Party this losing is a reason for voting in favor of something that has such large ramifications. But I do think that it will be a really serious disaster for the Democratic Party if this thing doesn't get through. You've had a huge investment pushing everything else more or less off the table over the course of the past year to do something that lots of people have tried and has never worked before.
Right.
And if it doesn't work, the Democrats, and if it doesn't work with a 60-seat majority in the Senate and a big majority in the House, then the Democrats are going to look like a party that can't govern. And that, I think, goes back to this point that I was just making about the calculation of the Republicans back in the spring. Make these people look like a party that can't govern by saying, we're going to say no to everything. We're going to set up a fight between Bernie Sanders and Joe Lieberman about health care and everything else. So I think it would be, it may not, look, there are lots of people who are not going to love the legislation, including a not inconsiderable number who think that it doesn't really go far enough, who support a public option or a single-payer system. But I think my guess is, and moreover, the real effects are not going to kick in for a while.
Yeah.
So people are going to say, "Gee, this is great! You passed this legislation. When do I get my insurance?" Well, it's going to take a while. But at the same time, I think there's the possibility, a reasonable possibility, that this will be seen as an extraordinary legislative achievement, and I think it is an extraordinary legislative achievement, as bad in many ways as it is, and as bad as the process is that produced it. But one of the things that you mentioned in the course of that, the issues that you were just raising, is about you pointed to Obama's earlier Obama's distance on the issue, and also to the fact that maybe he's getting the bill that he wanted. What I'm impressed by, as I looked at the West Point speech and also at the Nobel speech.
Okay, so we're shifting gears to international.
Yeah, let's shift gears. That was I was
good.
trying to make a quiet segue, and you blew the whistle.
I'm sorry. Go right ahead.
There we are. If you look, there's an odd disjuncture here. I mean, you look at the Nobel speech, and there's a kind of, some rhetorical uplift on foreign policy, particularly on the security side of foreign policy. I don't like some of the rhetoric, but, it's pretty high rhetoric. But this is a guy who just doesn't really, I'm not hearing, not paying enough attention, I'm not hearing any comparably soaring, uplifting, high moral, high principled rhetoric on issues of domestic policy and politics. It's just, this is, Obama seems to have adopted the posture of a kind of, rhetorical pragmatist on domestic policy, and, rhetorical
I think
uplift.
Let me suggest a reason for that.
Yeah.
Okay, which is that the high-soaring domestic rhetoric would be mildly left of center and very dangerous politically, whereas the high-soaring rhetoric in Oslo about just war and America as guarantor of the post-World War II security and prosperity with the blood of our soldiers and all of that was, if you will, slightly right of center, pretty close to what many Americans think, and not likely to be politically dangerous. I mean, there's another kind of high-minded, internationally oriented rhetoric, right? Instead of defending war, you might have you might have been a little bit closer to Martin Luther King's view of the United States exercise of its post-World War II suzerainty. That would have been high-soaring rhetoric, but it would have also been disastrous politically at home. So my theory on the whole thing is that it's not about a kind of uneven application of principle. It's about a consistent reading of the political winds and an effort to not run afoul of them. And I'm not begrudging him that. I'm just saying that's how I explain it to myself.
Yeah, it's disappointing, though, when even on the healthcare issue, I think, Ted Kennedy was a model, in a way, of, high-minded rhetoric and a willingness to, when it came to policy, to compromise on everything. And so, in the healthcare thing, Obama can be on the policy side, he can be a pragmatist, even while he's articulating the case for, the right. I don't remember in the healthcare speech if he ever reiterated this idea that this is about establishing a right to healthcare.
No, I don't think
now, maybe he thinks he's just going to lose people if he does that, but he can.
No, the idea that people have a right to healthcare is a pretty robustly progressive idea. If you were going to say socialism, I'd say, oh no, that goes too far. But to argue it vigorously, to argue the idea that what we're talking about here are human rights. For example, how would you make the illegal immigrant versus legal resident distinction stick if you really believe that people had a right to health care? Because these rights that people have don't end with them having a passport or a visa in their back pockets or not. So if you were to really stick your neck out there and really press this point about people have a right to health care, you'd be exposing yourself to attack from the right. No?
Not so sure. Look, there are constitutional rights and there are human rights, and you can, Obama is a subtle enough and smart enough guy that he could say that this is, the healthcare right is a right of all, citizens of the country, and doesn't have to be, a basic human right. But I think it's been a consistent thing. On the immigration issue, there's no soaring rhetoric. Nothing on an issue that you have given lots of attention to, the number of people in prisons. No attention to that. No soaring rhetoric on that. On the unemployed, no soaring rhetoric on the unemployed. And there's an issue where I don't think there would be that much political injury to being more rhetorically uplifting. But I think he has. I don't think it's been politically smart on the healthcare issue.
And on the banks.
Yeah. And on the banks. Been getting beaten up on these. And as I say, you can. Rhetoric isn't all cheap talk, but you can be like again, the example of Ted Kennedy. You can be somebody who's, got poetry. There's been no poetry on the domestic side. The poetry is reserved for the foreign policy. And people made a big deal out in the Nobel speech out of the point about there's evil in the world. Yeah. And
make no mistake about it.
Make no mistake about it. I'm looking at the speech here. It's a head of state. This is where he's distinguishing himself from Gandhi and King. Head of state sworn to protect and defend my nation cannot be guided by their examples alone. I face the world as it is and cannot stand idle in the face of threats to the American people. Next sentence. Okay, sentence one, threats to the American people. Sentence two, for make no mistake, evil does exist in the world.
Yep.
Well, is the point here that the only time you go to war is against evil? That you fight evil wherever it is? That you never... So let's take, the first Gulf War.
Okay.
Saddam Hussein then, bad guy, crosses an international border. Some people, it was a, divided view on whether or not that was a good, but the argument wasn't, here is evil
which must be
at work
stopped
in the world, which must be stopped.
Right.
So, take the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, initiating World War II. Evil. I don't know. Nazis evil, yes. Demonic evil, yes. Japanese, a good case for war against the Japanese, yes. Classic case for a just war.
But crusade against evil?
Crusade against evil, I don't know. Does that? I don't think so. Lots of bad. I just don't see that as. I think it's. I don't see that as a helpful way to think about. Yeah,
it does have a George W. Bush type ring to it.
Yeah.
But the other thing that occurred to me was, have we, that is the United States of America, never in those long decades of our global involvement, never been associated ourselves with activities that might rise to the threshold of evil or wrongdoing? I mean, do we have completely clean hands in these matters? I mean, was the conflict in Southeast Asia, for example, a just war under the president's configuration? I'm talking about a conflict that we were involved in for the better part of a decade.
Yeah, 500,000 troops and 55,000 plus. Americans killed and hundreds of thousands of these killed.
That was so. I'm not trying to answer the question here. I'm really just trying to ask it. Is it so black and white, self-evident that the United States of America, in the exercise of force, military force in the history of the last 50 years, has uniformly acted in a manner consistent with the highest ethical ideals? Now, I know that the president can't go to Oslo and criticize the United States of America, but he could forbear from reproducing this narrative, this sort of glorification of American national interests as being commensurate with ethical value. That's far from self-evident to me.
Right, and I think that moment in the speech that I was just referring to, where you identify threats to the American people, next sentence, for make no mistake, evil does exist in the world. Well, there's a lot of evil in the world that poses no threat to the American people. And there are lots of cases in which there are threats, and I think the Japan case is one, where the issue of evil doesn't seem particularly relevant or germane or helpful. So that kind of over rhetorical moralization of American foreign policy and decisions about the use of force, I don't think is.
And I have to add something, Josh, and I know it's a touchy matter, but it's not just the United States of America whose actions the president was implicitly defending in that speech in Oslo. Mm-hmm. It's also our allies who act under our protection and often with very substantial support from us. I'm talking in particular about Israel. I'm talking about the war in Lebanon in 2006 and the war in Gaza in late 2008 and early 2009. Yeah. Now, the president basically said to the world community as he was accepting the Nobel Prize that those were just wars. He didn't say so explicitly and in so many words, but that conclusion has to follow from the actions of our government, the preceding administration and his own, and the structure of our international relations and commitments. So that is, again, far from self-evidently the case. I understand it's controversial, but let me just say that I'm disappointed in the moral vision of a man who says he stands where he is because of the life work of Martin Luther King. He invokes Martin Luther King and invokes him again. Okay? And yet the extent of his moral and humanitarian vision is such as it has been revealed to be. And I'm sorry, I know that's harsh, but I'm upset about the president not treading a little bit more carefully as he was, wrapping himself in this kind of moralistic argument about Americans' actions on the international stage.
Yeah, I mean, the place where push comes to shove on this, or rubber meets the road, or whatever the right metaphor is in the decision about the escalation of the counterinsurgency war in Afghanistan,
yes.
which is what that speech was partly about. And I think there are two questions about that war. One question is, can that war, can you succeed? And the other is, do you have to? Do you have to fight it? First question, can you win it? Second question, do you have to fight it? Probably best to ask him in reverse order. And on the issue of can you win it, I think if you step back a little bit from the high moral rhetoric, and you ask the question this way: can an occupying army, working hand in hand with a corrupt regime and a dysfunctional military, implement a successful counterinsurgency strategy designed to win the hearts and minds of the Afghan people? That's not a particularly promising strategy, but that's, I think, the kind of question that gets obscured when you go in for identifying, threats to the country with the existence of evil in the world. I don't think thinking that you're fighting evil is a particularly helpful way of asking the question: is this a winnable fight? And then also asking the question, do you have to fight it? I think if you look at I've read the West Point speech about 5 times now.
Yeah.
And the thing that I find most remarkable about the West Point speech is, it's not a long speech, but it's long enough to have said a bunch of stuff about why why this fight is essential. And there really is, as far as I can tell, one sentence in the entire speech that explains why you've got to fight. He says, "I'm convinced that our security is at stake in Afghanistan and Pakistan." Okay, you can believe that and not think that you should send 30,000 more troops in.
Right.
It's from here that we were attacked on 9/11. That's correct. It's from here that new attacks are being plotted as I speak. No idle danger. No hypothetical threat. Well, there are lots of places where attacks are being plotted.
Right.
And this is a serious business.
Some of them are here in the United States.
Some of them are here in the United States.
Okay.
That's the sentence that makes the case. It's from here. It's from here that we were attacked, and it's from here that new attacks are being plotted as I speak. I think that the danger of the high-minded rhetoric and the identification of threats with evil, and evil is of course something you have to extirpate from the world. I don't think that helps in thinking about these two questions, which is, number one, can an occupying force conduct a successful counterinsurgency strategy in collaboration with a corrupt government and a dysfunctional military? That's one question. And second,
clearly you're dubious about that.
Yes, you've detected.
And secondly, what's the point?
Yeah, and then do you? But then look,
do we need to be there?
Do you have to do it? Do you have to do it?
Let me just say this, Judge, because I was disappointed with the president's West Point speech about Afghanistan too, primarily. Not only because of the weakness of the argument, and the argument both with respect to the counterinsurgency and the imperative of the action, that is to say, the argument that the surge would work, we could win the hearts and minds, and then the argument also that, this is necessary for our security, seemed weak to me.
Yeah.
But something else bothered me about it, too, which was that this enshrining of the 9/11 event as the cornerstone from which we then construct a grand strategy about global affairs. And I mean, my preference would have been to diminish the significance of 9/11, not to reiterate again 10 years after the fact, practically. Not to reiterate again the need for this to drive us now in our deployment, to drive us in our posture, but to diminish it, to kind of try to get out of the war on terror, rather than, in effect, whether we call it so or not, digging ourselves more deeply and more permanently into the war on terror.
Yeah. Well, I think I guess I agree with you about that, and I think these things are related. Let's just, instead of saying, well, we are in a war on terror, therefore let's continue to prosecute that war, ask these two questions fresh. Question number one, can you succeed in a counterinsurgency strategy in collaboration with a corrupt regime and a dysfunctional military? Good reason for skepticism about that. But if you have to do it, you have to do it. So do you have to do it? And I think it's stunning that there is so, this is a thoughtful and smart guy. I'm sure he takes this decision very seriously. I don't want to dispute that. But when I look at the rationale, I think it is, I think it's, terribly.
But Josh, the question is not about the president's thoughtfulness and intelligence.
Right.
The question is about his leadership abilities and his ability to envision and then to, project this different way of doing things.
Yeah.
And I just think there's a question there, and I don't know have you seen the recent issue of the American Interest magazine? Which
I know the magazine, but I haven't read it. No.
So it's the cover is called something like "Flirting with Failure," and then they say, "Yep, you heard us right," because what you're saying, flirting with. And then they've got, small pieces, 1,000 words or so from, 15 or 20 people who are, some of the, usual suspects you'd imagine from the left and from the right on foreign policy. But I'm telling you that you read through those reviews, and they come from all angles of the political spectrum, and the net weight of it is very depressing. For how the president is being viewed. I mean, for example, people were saying that in the Chinese and the Russian and the Iranian and other governments, they're not taking the president seriously, and they think that he can be rolled.
Yeah.
People were saying that his generals have played him and backed him into a corner.
Yeah.
People are saying that, and then I could go on down the litany. He pulls missiles out, the deployment of the missile shield thing in Western Europe, and he gets nothing from the Russians on behalf of it. And they go on down the list, but the sort of the weight of it is really quite impressively negative on the first year returns. The best that can be said as a consensus of these reviews is it's just the first year and things might get a lot better. So it's not over yet. Still time to recover.
Yeah. We should wrap this.
Okay.
I just want to make two quick points. One of which bears on that, and then there's a second, just a kind of signing off point, which is. One of the things that I'm struck by in Obama's speeches, and I found it again in the West Point speech, is it goes to somewhere in the neighborhood of what you were just talking about. There is a kind of defensiveness that creeps in. So he says, I don't make this decision lightly. I oppose the war in Iraq, et cetera, et cetera. And then about a minute or so later, he says, so no, I don't make this decision lightly. Now, who is he answering when he says he doesn't make this decision lightly? Who thinks he's taking this decision lightly? Who is he? What kind of criticism is he responding to? It's just it's a kind of rhetorical posture that he often adopts, which is a kind of defending himself against a kind of some would say type of thing. It's unstated. But I found it very striking. I mean, nobody thinks you make these decisions lightly, or anyway, you don't say, as president, who's sending, I don't make this decision lightly, and then say again. So no, I don't make this decision lightly. I make it.
That's an interesting point, Judge.
Last point here, and this tying the two parts of the discussion together. There is this argument that I've seen on the Daily Kos and a few other places. I think Glenn Greenwald repeated it recently, which is that the people who are that there's this division in the progressive community. That people who are in favor of this health care legislation are the same people who were in favor of liberals liberals and progressives who supported the invasion of Iraq, and that there are a bunch of compromisers who are prepared to, go along to get along, or get along to go along, or whatever. And it's this. And I just want to say, I think that is total bullshit. There are lots of people, and I'm saying this partly in self-defense. Lots of people who are in favor of the health care legislation, who were very strongly opposed to the invasion of Iraq, and it's just it makes it always makes your work easier if you can say, the same people who are in favor of this thing that I'm opposed to are in favor of this other thing that turned out to be terrible. Well, it's not. Just in this case, it just isn't true.
I think I can put myself in that category as well.
Good. Well, in that happy note of comedy, good to talk. Okay.
Very good to talk to you, Josh.
Okay.
Take care of yourself.